I couldn't help at one point in my discussions privately with General Secretary Gorbachev, when you stop to think that we're all God's children, wherever we may live in the world, I couldn't help but say to him, just think how easy his task and mine might be in these meetings that we held if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe. We'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our countries, and we would find out once and for all that we really are all human beings here on this earth together. Well, I don't suppose we can wait for some alien race to come down and threaten us, but I think that between us we can bring about that realization. In our obsession with antagonisms of the moment, we often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? What could be more alien to the universal aspirations of our peoples than war and the threat of war? I think maybe I'd answer it this way. I keep, in my frustration sometimes, you know, actually, if you count some of the things going on in smaller countries and all, there have been about 114 wars since World War II. But I've often wondered, what if all of us in the world discovered that we were threatened by a power from outer space, from another planet? Wouldn't we all of a sudden find that we didn't have any differences between us at all? We were all human beings, citizens of the world, and wouldn't we come together to fight that particular threat?
This is going to be a really great conversation. You are not going to want to miss it. I'm speaking with Matt Ehret. He is a historian. He looks at things that other people don't look at. He looks at the history, the real history that happened in both the United States, Canada, and the world. He's gone down rabbit holes by looking at original documents. And this is key. Don't take our word for it. You can also do your own research. And I know it's very popular right now with mainstream media that say, don't do your own research, just go to us. If you remember that when the WikiLeaks came out, you had Chris Cuomo say to everybody that don't go to WikiLeaks, go to CNN and they'll tell you what's important. Well, if you're a thinking human being, you have to do your own research, because I believe, and I believe Matt believes this too, that our future depends on it. Because if you don't know where you've come from, how will you know where you are or where you're going? And before I introduce Matt and what brought us together, I want to read a quote, because I think this quote symbolizes the work that Matt is doing, along with many other people who are speaking truth to power. And it happens to be the last speech that Martin Luther King Jr. gave before he was assassinated. He gave it when he was 38 years old, and 3 months after he gave this speech, he was no longer with us. And it goes like this: you may be 38 years old, as I happen to be, and one day some great opportunity stands before you and calls you to stand up for some great principles, some great issue, some great cause, and you refuse to do it because you are afraid. You refuse to do it because you want to live longer. You are afraid that you will lose your job, or you are afraid that you will be criticized, that you will lose your popularity, or you're afraid that somebody will stab you or shoot you at you or bomb your house. So you refuse to take the stand. You may may go on and live until you are 90, but you are just as dead at 38 as you would be at 90. And the cessation of breathing in your life is but the belated announcement of an earlier death of the spirit. In essence, if you don't follow your call, that you're meant to speak your truth, doesn't matter how long you die, you will just join your spirit, your soul, when your body leaves the earth, because you will have already died. Matt has actually gone and done research. He spoke in truths that I'm sure a lot of people in the power structure don't like. And he just finished writing a few weeks ago an article that caught my attention. Matt runs an organization called the Canadian Patriot. It's a sovereign voice in a chorus of nations. And the article he wrote is called "What Do UFOs, Lawrence Rockefeller, and A.K.A. Ultra Have in Common More Than You Think?" Matt, what inspired you to write this article and share with us? Give us a summary of what it is, and let's discuss it.
Thank you, Peter, for the platform and for another great conversation. I really do appreciate, before I answer that directly, that I do appreciate you opening with that MLK quote. And sure enough, I mean, MLK was a man who really had confronted his mortality and the fear of mortality and really gone through the fire and he came out of that process, as anyone must, who does really honestly confront the fact of our mortality with the pursuit of what is the higher purpose of life, with a greater degree and power of wisdom that gave him a capacity to do things that most people couldn't comprehend. How this man was able to have the energy, the creative stamina, and the ability to look the devil in the face and not blink. And even, I was reviewing just yesterday his From the Mountaintop speech delivered on April 3rd. He died April 4th, where he's very clear. He's obviously received a lot of threats to his life. And he, tells the people listening in the stadium that I may not get there with you. I'd like to lead a long life, but I've seen the promised land. And I know he had faith that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think that that's the faith that we all need to really tap into at this time of crisis, because ultimately we are up against powers and principalities. We are up against an oligarchical structure, which is it stands in defiance of truth and any concepts of God, the soul, that have given rise to the greatest creative leaps into goodness in all of human history. This institution, which goes back thousands of years, has always existed as sort of like a parasite, ideologically committed to crushing the good. And that idea of humankind being made in the living image of a loving creator, endowed by such not only with inalienable rights, but also with inalienable powers of reason, and improving the powers of reason through making greater discoveries and changing or modifying our identities in accordance with the discoverable laws of creation, has been at the heart of everything good, including the American Revolution. You look at the founding fathers, you can't understand what motivated these people to risk so much for the sake of an idea unless you tap into that awareness. And I think due to the fact that we live today 50 plus years into a consumer society, sort of go nowhere, stagnant culture, we've increasingly lost connection with our true essence as a species endowed with these powers. Now, I think that as far as that article, that essay that I recently published, it was something that I had originally done a lot of research on some years back. I decided, since I'm working on a book right now, to better, it'll be volume 5 of my Clash of the Two Americas book series. I'm doing the finishing touches on it right now. And I wanted to really zero in on what is the British Empire as a still existent force in world affairs that has taken over control of the United States through the management of fifth columnists going back to 1776. That was the topic. Some of this was the topic of my previous 3 books of the series, but this one I really wanted to focus on, well, what is this thing called a modern British Empire today that still exists? It didn't go away in 1945.
Can I just share something which you touched
Sure.
upon it, because it's for me, it's always the most powerful part of the Declaration of Independence, and it's always stuck with me. And it was the last sentence. It says, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." And that to me is really the essence. And John Hancock, the reason he signed his signature so big, because he said, "Come and get me, because my soul is more valuable than anything else. And I want King George or Saxburg Cope or whatever he was to take my life." So go on with your.
No, exactly. And I mean, the founding fathers also knew that they didn't create a democracy as such. They understood, and you read the writings, they understood that a democracy was just the flip side of a tyranny. It was the same thing. And a demos just means ruled by the mob. And the mob, if people think like a mob, everyone has seen the behavior of how individuals lose their individuality and are capable of degrees of viciousness and stupidity when they're in a herd, which they would never do individually. And the herd is always something which, if you allow yourself to get into that, you're always going to be controlled by a demagogue who is able to control the masses by either giving them false arrogance or fear of the other, right? That there's always going to be the demagogue will get you to be afraid of that which you don't understand, or will just be able to keep you in a state of general terror or idiotic bliss. Either way, it won't be encouraging the sovereignty of the individual to actually rise. And the founding fathers were very explicit that a democratic republic is what they created. And John Quincy Adams said it best, that a democratic republic only can exist in a devoutly religious people who are moral. If you don't have that cultural standard maintaining and improving upon itself and the people generation to generation, if that disappears, you cannot have a democratic republic. It will be in name only. It will become easily a feudal oligarchy, maybe with the outward veneer of capitalism or democracy, but it won't be real. So that's part of the interesting thing. And it does all touch on the question of, well, why did I write this paper on UFOs, the Rockefellers, MK Ultra, and why am I writing this book on the British Empire, which this is going to be a chapter in that book. Part of the book, the way I set it up before I get it, what is the modern British Empire and how it took over, especially over the dead bodies of Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy. There was this, it wasn't that there was these assassinations from within the United States. It's that these assassinations occurred in order for the culmination of a coup, a takeover of the means of conducting economic, military, and other forms of policy, both domestically and foreign policy wise, which had to it could only occur if true patriots were wiped out at that period. So I go into what are some of the mythologies, the explanatory models that have been concocted by creative writers affiliated with intelligence agencies to deflect the mind of creative people who think outside the box into misdirections so that they devote their time and energy into things that avoid the real causal hand of this oligarchy, which goes back, if you look at the families that have been maintaining their continuity of structures of empire, it goes back hundreds, thousands of years. But they don't want people to see that. They don't want to, and so I try to get across that in the course of the book. And I have a chapter on bad guys are the Jesuits. So I have a chapter on the Jesuit conspiracy. What are the Jesuits? How were they created as a synthetic cult in the 15th century out of Venice, ironically, not even Spain. I got a chapter on UFOs, because that's another thing that absorbs, it has oftentimes there's many explanatory models, whether it's David Icke with shape-shifting lizards from another dimension, or there's a whole bunch of variants. They often will capture people's attention. They had my attention for many years. I was a big fan of this stuff for years. And the reason why is because they'll tell you a bunch of factually true things, whether it's about 9/11, bankers' conspiracies, ancient conspiracies, all of these things. And so you give your trust over by the trivial factoids that are blatantly true, provably so. And as soon as your sentinels of reason go to sleep, you let in all of the other, like David Icke, I would say he's right about 95% of the material.
Right.
But then it's that 5% of, oh yeah, and they're shape-shifting lizards from the 13th dimension sucking your fear energy, which is the real heart of all of the problems. And it's like, as soon as you take that one in, it doesn't matter that you think that 95% of the information you now have is true. That 5% just,
it's like having fresh water and then someone throws in a turd in the barrel. It just pollutes the whole thing.
That's a terrible, truthful, exact analogy. That's exactly it. So that's what got me on it. And I started doing a little bit of work on like, well, why is it that the Pentagon the Pentagon right now, the British government for the past 3 years have really been putting a lot of energy into investigations and disclosures of UFO aerial phenomena. And at a time of such global historic proportion that we're living in right now, we're living in a time of systemic change. We're on a very high danger of a nuclear war, a major civilizational crisis. At the same measure, there's a lot of opportunity in time of such crisis too. So there's a lot of good, a lot of bad. It can go either way. But why now at this moment would they put such resources into something like this at this point, right? So then it got me started when I was like digging a little bit around, and I found that one of the key figures who was among the loudest for disclosure amongst Washington insiders was a figure who became infamous around Pizzagate, a former assistant to Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton's campaign manager.
You mean the one he does like special signs
all over the place? Yeah, he's into all sorts of stuff. And this guy was like one of the, and it wasn't just that he was a champion of this in the past few years. It goes back to the late 90s. He was really advocating full aliens disclosure, talking about Area 51.
And this gentleman's name is?
John Podesta.
John Podesta, and isn't he back in the White House right now as an advisor?
I think so, but I have to verify that. So don't quote me on that at the moment. Maybe you could do a Google search while we're talking, but I might be right. He's definitely an insider, very close to Hillary. He's very close to all of the Obama insiders and
he's
the
into spirit cooking as well.
Yeah, he taps into the Maria Abramovich networks, and it gets disturbing. And like I said, the Pizzagate stuff. I know you're not supposed to talk about that in public society, but it was a thing. That's a thing. But so around him, he participated.
Can I just share with you quickly, because I did Google it. Yep. John Podesta has been appointed to develop climate strategies.
There you go. There you go. Well, that plays into the Lawrence Rockefeller thing. So part of this was that, well, Podesta was involved with the creation and maintenance of an organization called To the Stars Academy. They got a cardboard cutout frontman named Tom DeLonge, who, for those who might have listened to punk music in the 90s, would have recognized the name as being the front singer for Blink-182. And Tom DeLonge, he's not an intellectual. He's sort of, like I said, a cardboard cutout, doesn't know how he's being used, doesn't understand it, but they needed somebody as a front person, who's not obviously directly a CIA operative. So they picked him. He's like, he needed a purpose to life. And he was a fanatic for UFO stuff since he was a kid. He read the books on his tours, or at least listened to audio tapes. I don't know. But
it makes me think of Elvis Presley's famous meeting with Nixon, where he became a sheriff against illegal drugs, even though he died. Yeah.
I didn't know about that.
He actually got appointed because he believed that the youth were being poisoned with illegal drugs. Huh. So Nixon was not very popular at the time. Watergate was happening. So he went, and they had a famous meeting. You can see pictures of the two of them. And he gets appointed to be a sheriff against drugs, even though he took legal drugs.
Yeah, right. That's funny. That's super funny. I didn't know that, but it is not that different, I guess, in that sense. Maybe Nixon wasn't as savvy of an operator as some of these controllers are, but he has handlers. And when you look at the website of the organization that has really spearheaded and poured millions and millions of dollars into various forms of not just disclosure of UFOs, but also it sells itself as a venture capitalist group that is putting money into advanced tech that they're saying is in Area 51. If we could just get disclosure, we could get this advanced tech, and then we could have all of these great discoveries in AI and what have you. Anyway, you've got on the boards of directors and advisors, you have people like the former director of White House Board of Technology. You got the former CIA Counter Biological Weapons Program Director, the former Deputy Secretary of Defense. Plus, you have a weird character by the name of a billionaire named Robert Bigelow, who's a big funder and backer of this. So Robert Bigelow, who's he? He's a guy who made his fortune running real estate companies, hotels, things like that, motels all over the USA. And he made a lot of money. I don't think he's a sovereign individual. I think he was always used kind of like the way Bill Gates is, not an actual entrepreneur. He's used because they have a purpose. There's a role that he will play, or Elon Musk.
They needed to create a backstory for him, and maybe I think what happens, and I just want to share, and this is just a thought on my part, is they create them because we know how fractional banking works. It became very obvious with Epstein. No one knew how he made his money, but in essence, if you know how money's made and how PR is done, we don't know. As I shared with you before this call, I'm putting up a video that I did with Patrick Moore, the co-founder of Greenpeace, and he pointed out very simply one thing. He said they like scaring people from things that they can't see, like carbon and viruses, and polar bears on ice floes, like things that nobody can actually witness themselves. And in essence, that's I think that actually ties into this. This is the scare us to give our rights away.
We are in a situation, as you said, where what most people are afraid of are things that they can't see, smell, taste, or touch, but it's been created in their imagination by pseudoscientific warmongering consensuses, other things like the fear, like you said, of climate change, the fact that we're killing polar bears, which is actually not true. When you look at it, the polar bear species is actually massively larger today than it was even 30 years ago. Or we're afraid of radiations, which is why we're justifying the shutdown of nuclear power all over the earth when we need it the most, regardless of the fact that we live saturated in a radioactive environment, both from within the earth, but also from the sun, from cosmic rays. It's an invisible ocean of cosmic rays, and it's natural that we have a certain healthy bandwidth of it, but people have been led to believe it's all bad. So you got all of these things that, or little viruses that you can't see that you're just supposed to be afraid of or something. So we're afraid of these ideas, and there's no reason to be afraid of any of those things. And then the things that we should actually be afraid of, there are things that we should legitimately be afraid of because we could do something about it. We're not paying attention. So the breakdown of the financial system, a lot more people are going to die on the earth if you have a complete breakdown of the entire fabric of civilization through the explosion of the banking system or the launching of nuclear weapons. Oligarchs are too fanatically committed to their New World Order script that they're unwilling to break with their trajectory and go flight forward.
Or this month, Germany is still scheduled to close down its last 3 nuclear plants. Like we're talking, you can find this in history where societies almost become suicidal.
Yeah, it really is that. No, there is a certain subconscious, I think. Well, for some forces, it might be very, but on some level, I think there's a subconscious factor into this as well of an existential nihilistic suicide impulse that's allowing people to go along with something that's going to destroy not just themselves but their kids and grandkids. Yes. It's unbelievably. Even if you're a radical Darwinist, you have to have trouble with the idea. And I'm not, but I'm saying that even if you were, the idea of Darwinian laws of survival is that life wants to try to survive by its nature. So this runs contrary to every instinct and impulse to even basic self-interest. So there's something else going on.
Well, that goes hand in hand with your article, because where people become nihilistic and they're waiting for the end of the world, such as in 2012, people were frightened that the world was going to end, and they were fearful, and a lot of people stopped their lives. And then December 21st, 2012 came, and it went, and we were still here. However, going back to the next stage, and that would be little gray men are going to show up and dictate to us. And it's very interesting. I read your article. You also talked about MK Ultra. You've also mentioned in other works, Monarch and the Church Commission. And the fact is that they're playing on these huge fears of us to go and get compliance. And that goes hand in hand with what you were sharing earlier about democracy being mob rule, because when the mob is scared, they choose a leader or leaders. And if I have a plan and you don't have a plan, I'm more likely to go and get you to do what I want to do. And unfortunately, most people had a pattern interruption in their lives starting specifically in March 2020. And they didn't know what. They were scared of, something they couldn't see killing them. Therefore, they passed on all their power. And this, I believe, goes hand in hand with it's starting to fall apart. People are basically giving that middle finger to all these people who are telling them what they should do, and they're just laughing at their face. I thought the best way that the Red Wedding, the Biden speech was handled was by Tucker Carlson, where he just laughed. He just laughed at everybody in the administration. You can't even get, it's to the point where it's comical. So that narrative is breaking down. And Von Braun is reported during the last few years of his life saying that when everything else fails, use the gray men. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about your article. Please share with us what you discovered and how we can prepare for this, and we can educate our fellow human beings, because it's the golden rule.
Yeah, sure.
We have to educate, because I only do these videos for self-serving interest, because if people aren't awake, I'm going to be threatened, because I'm going to be a heretic. I need as many heretics as possible.
Yeah, definitely. No, absolutely.
So if you can take over and just share with your discovery. I loved your article. I read it a few times.
Okay, yeah, sure. And what you're saying about Von Braun, the man was basically saying a truth that was known for centuries, if not millennia, that, it's always easier to control the masses if they're in a state of fear and a state of ignorance of the unknown. You're more inclined to be afraid of something that you don't understand. You'll be afraid of your neighbors, your others, if you don't actually understand them. So if that's the case, a population that is fearful has no space in their soul for creativity, for real, genuine problem solving, organizing organically as humans do. They can't really do that because of the inner turmoil. And so that's preyed upon always, and it always has been preyed upon. Von Braun, living as he did in the age of aerospace technology, the atom, and what have you, recognized very clearly that, especially just reading the writings of some of these social engineers like H.G. Wells, who was already essentially, documenting how this could effectively be used in his so-called fiction works earlier on at the turn of the century. This had been already discussed by high-level social engineers for a long time. The creation of how do you get the population to be induced into a fear state by attacks of extraterrestrials, things from the unknown. Obviously, before the age of the so-called scientific revolution, it was more, it took the form more of demagogues describing how demons and other things were going to control you if you don't behave a certain way. So it's taken on a new form, but it's the myth is always sort of modified, but with the same principles.
And it works.
It works every time. Yeah.
It does, and the perfect example is Orson Welles on October 30th, 1938, in War of the Worlds. Like he had a radio broadcast. It happened the day before Halloween. Everyone was frightened about what was happening in Europe with Hitler and everything. They were nervous. They didn't know if they were going to war. They weren't. The Nazis were in America too. It just was not a good time. And here was Orson Welles. He had this radio broadcast pretending that there was an invasion in New Jersey, and people who turned in after it started literally thought it was true because it was being broadcast throughout the United States. And there were people going to the farm where supposedly these aliens had destroyed the US Army to go and defend America and defend the human race. And they had to interrupt that broadcast when they started getting reports that people thought this was real. And just think about it, we hadn't even, rockets really didn't exist. People weren't planning to go to the moon at that point. They didn't have the technology, but we're talking America just froze. And this is something that they know that works. And the interesting thing is, whoever's running the show, they are the least creative people of all time because they don't come up with anything new. It's like a bad rerun. However, there's new audiences to play those narratives and those stories. So please go on.
Yeah, sure. Well, what these guys, I think what they've wanted to do for quite some time as part of the Great Reset, like this Great Reset didn't come up overnight in March 2020. This has been planned for many generations as an idea of like turning on and off again the video game, right? And resetting the human, they think of human beings kind of like machines, which is why they also think that it's inevitable that AI will replace humans unless we merge with humans at the point of singularity. So they got all of these theories that animate the governing sort of strata who are invited to things like Davos or the Bilderberger group. They're transhumanists. Now, at the same measure as they think that, they know we need sacredness. Like human beings need to have spirituality, a sense of the sacred as part of the human condition. Computers don't need that. Animals don't need that. Humans need that. So what these social engineers are trying to do, and what they've been talking about, is how do you craft a new paradigm, a new great narrative. That's actually the name that Klaus Schwab gave the Great Narrative Project, for the new stories that will be managed by a new priest class, essentially himself and his Davos clique, to shape humankind coming out of this post-collapse age into the new sort of post-history era, where supposedly nothing is going to change anymore. We're going to get this full, in his mind, utopia, and the reality dystopia of just, perfect stasis, where everybody just knows how to behave like talking cows, and the oligarchy is just never going to be challenged again. And that's it. Like, they've got a real fictitious world that they're committed to. And so the idea of creating new mythologies, new religions that maybe carry some of the essence or the form of the old religions, but with a new essence, involves the creation also of aliens. It involves drugs, video games, the disassociation from reality using ideas like metaverse, which is already pretty bad because we've already gone pretty far down this world where most people can't tell the difference between a reality TV and a reality. And also, so you got drugs, you got virtual reality, you got holograms. Things like Project Blue Book have been, talked about, developed since the 80s and 90s to use holography in order to create an illusion that you have. And holographic technology can get quite realistic today, and it's going to get better. But they are thinking about utilizing these things to give people a sense around the world that, aliens have come, and perhaps this would be something that would involve people having been traumatized for a few years of economic shock therapy, where there's just fear, war, scarcity, chaos, kind of like the Great Depression.
It's also mass formation, isn't it?
Very much so.
People need to project that fear onto something, and that's something that I guess most during what's happened the last few years, like the top people happen to be the social behaviorists who are knowing exactly how the majority of people are going to behave.
Kind of. They kind of know and they kind of don't. Like as long as they can keep us in a bestialized state, they know how we're going to behave, because beasts will behave as beasts given certain stimulation, certain pain. They will be more like human beings who are victimized and bestialized by the empire to be, just consumers living in hedonistic moment-to-moment experiences, are people who are more susceptible to their subconscious basement. They won't necessarily be in charge of their decision making. So things like advertisement that has been used for the whole 20th century is more, they'll be more susceptible to that sort of thing, like that we see from Edward Bernays and that whole revolution in manipulation. Whereas people who
Freud's cousin, who is the founder of propaganda, right?
His nephew, exactly, who basically created this and there's a documentary series called The Century of Self going through that, but people can read Bernays's writings too, where he's very clear. Walter Whitman does the same thing. Whitman. The point being is though that this can only work if people don't know themselves, if they haven't been given proper access to a self-examination of who they are, why they are, what does it mean to be human. If they haven't been exposed to that, and they're thus blind coming out of an education system, which is a corrupt education system, they will walk into the world sort of never having their own will, because they've never learned how to make their own judgments or use their own minds. Their opinions and convictions, like Bertrand Russell even says, will not be from them. They'll have convictions, some convictions that they're even maybe willing to die for, but they're not coming from within them. They've been put there by the social engineers. And
they begin with the conclusion when they speak, right? Like someone else has given them a script. Many people might know of Robert Bly, and he wrote Iron John, where he talks about like men coming to themselves. But a book that I found much more influencing on me is he called something the sibling society, that we don't even have adults anymore. We don't have initiation anymore, where you make people, you initiate them and they go through trials and they have a connection to the tribe. So right now, when we get to mass formation, the people really don't have any type of connection, so they're easily able to be manipulated. And I was in sales for most of my life, and I knew that if I walked into a situation and I had actually worked out like every sentence I said, I knew 99% of the time, unless the person had spent a lot of introspection, that they would do exactly what I wanted. Because if you have a plan and most people don't, then you're going to win. It's just, unfortunately, and a lot of people, they're too busy, they're in debt, they're right now, it's almost like you're having bullets shot over your head. So these plans that you discovered, share with us what you discovered in your research, because I found it fascinating.
Right. Sorry. Yeah, I haven't really dug into that. So, okay. So I brought up before Robert Bigelow, a big funder who's poured a lot of his fortune into alien disclosure. Harry Reid has passed bills. He was also provided a lot of money by Bigelow. Together, they set up the Advanced Aerospace Threats Program in 2017. Bigelow is also an investor, like I said, into the Stars Academy with all of these CIA operatives. Tom DeLonge, like he even says in his promotional video, like, I really wanted a purpose to my life, and I cared about UFOs and aliens, and I know there's a connection. And then all of a sudden, I was tapped on the shoulder by a very high-level person from the CIA. And all of a sudden, I was invited into all of these amazing insider meetings, and they really trusted me. And, he really believes that they actually respect him. And it's weird. It's sad to listen to. Anyway, so you look at like Bigelow. Bigelow, first of all, he is somebody who gets us a little bit closer, who's aware of what he's doing in a slightly a greater degree, at least, than an idiot like DeLonge. I don't know how to pronounce his name. But he's also part of what's called the New Space Movement, the idea of stripping the nation state and having the idea of space exploration and space tech driven entirely by private venture capitalism and billionaires, instead of the nation state. And there has been an ongoing onslaught and attack since JFK's murder against the institution of the sovereign nation state itself in order to replace it with an idea of global government above nation states.
That's
So
not accountable. That's not accountable to the people. I think that's got to be stressed, right? Like as soon as you, like recently, you know, not going on a tangent, but there's been recent information coming out that the government has spoke to these big social media sites and told them to deplatform people, and they're saying, well, we can't do anything, they're private businesses, but it's a good way of actually, if we really went through the layers, we'd find out much of this technology that we're being exposed to, especially in the internet, is really government technology. But they actually said, well, you know, we're not allowed to be directly involved, so we're going to create these companies and we're going to hide behind the fact that they are private industry. We can't do anything. I have no control. Like they're beating you up. I have no control. It's like a mother who basically says, well, my son misbehaves. Like he's his own human being. Even though I'm poking him, it's like I have no control of what he does.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you were talking about Bigelow.
Yeah. And so all of these guys, and this includes also, you know, the Virgin Records guy, Branson, involves Elon Musk, involves Bezos. They're all pushing for privatized venture capitalists, billionaires in space for tourism. But the idea is always, it's what you might call a Delphic operation to say, because all human beings kind of, as you pointed out, as a salesperson, what works is that, you know, everybody wants a pathway, a solution to something, but they don't have necessarily the capacity to carve it out themselves. So they need help. And if you know that as a salesperson, you can use a formula, tap into that because you know the yearning is there and activate it. So the same thing too, everybody sort of, I think deep down by virtue of being human, it's not just that we also need the sacred, we also need purpose. We need to go beyond what we are. Like that is sort of a spiritual impulse is to leap beyond our limits, whether it's of knowledge, our limits to growth, all of that. And kids do it, babies do it. That's why babies learn to, if we didn't have that impulse as a primary impulse, we wouldn't ever learn how to speak or walk, right? But at a certain point, if you've got a bad society, it gets beaten down so that by the time you're maybe 10, 12 years old, you learn to sit down and shut up or just behave instead of actually excelling and having a good ambition to go beyond yourself, you know? So I think part of this is that human beings will always yearn for leaping into space to explore the unknown. That's a fundamental impulse. And what this new space movement has done is they've captured that, and they're saying truthful things that appeal to that underlying yearning. You know, Elon Musk says a lot of very, very reasonable things regarding, like, why he says things like, why don't we have magnetic levitation rail? Why don't we have the things that we used to believe were possible in the 1960s and 70s? Why did that go? We should have more people, maybe even. All reasonable things which would be true even if he didn't say it. But
can I just add something?
Yep.
As he says all these pro-humanistic things, he wants to go and have like drivable cars, and lithium batteries are worse than any carbon that gas is going to do. He wants neural net. He actually has SpaceX. Everything that he's pushing, what he's doing, he's a front man for, is all anti-human. However, he talks a really good game, and if you do digging, you get like, you start really seeing things. I don't know if you ever heard that von Braun wrote a book in 1952 about going to Mars. Did you find that? Have you?
Yeah, one of the characters is Musk or something. Who's
Elon?
Elon, that's it. Yeah.
You can't like, the thing is, you just can't write this stuff because there's the adventures of Baron Trump, and he happens to live, he's a mischievous individual, and he happens to live exactly where Trump Tower is. You know, it's like when you start seeing these things, you're thinking like, there's a lot of planning that goes into a lot of things that we're being exposed to.
There's a lot of boredom amongst the oligarchical class. I mean, you got to keep in mind, this is a class that is born to be useless eaters. Like they talk about useless eaters, but they themselves are the useless eaters because they have no skills. They're
Are you talking about our current king?
I'm talking about the whole thing that he's a part of. Yeah, he's a great example. But I mean, the whole.
Could you imagine what they talk about? They don't know how the food got there. Like I saw his butler. This is King Charles III, right? They talk about how they lay his socks out, how he lives in these massive palaces, and he's giving us a lecture in Scotland in 2021 on the environment, how we should cut back. What's his cutting back's going to be? Or the best is, if you look at Davos, the last meeting, I think they set a record. There were over 1,500 private jets parked. So it's really interesting. I didn't want to leave that opportunity for us to focus on that they are useless eaters. And when they call us useless eaters, when there's a hurricane, it's usually these men who are misogynists, whatever. They're the ones who are going out and they're like putting their putting their lives at risk. Like all these, when you think about it. And I want to point out something. Just one last thing. I'm gonna, Bill Gates. I saw him and his wife talking about how they wanted to give minorities first at this. I really took a look after that. I said, I've never seen him with minorities other than in Africa doing this to little children. Like never have I, when you look at pictures of him, you never see him with minorities, but he wants to give. He's going out saying he wants to give minorities, but it's what you do, not what you say. And let's go on. So you did your investigation and share with me what you've discovered.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So based on everything, to recapture the key thread, this entire thing, like where did Hillary, who also made her campaign commitment in 2015, if she were elected president, to like make UFO disclosure a top priority? Obama said something similar. Where did all of these deep state creeps get their passion and direction from? Do they actually themselves believe it? I don't think they do. But one thing that's very important is there's all of these photographs, and this is what caught me, of Hillary Clinton and Podesta and Bill at the Lawrence Rockefeller Ranch in the 1990s. And Lawrence Rockefeller's in the White House a lot. And he's a guy who's, he's somebody who's very high up, brother of David Rockefeller, Trilateral Commission high official. Now, Lawrence Rockefeller is a fellow who had his own role to play. Each member of the Rockefeller family, and unfortunately had a very nefarious and destructive role. Nelson had his role to play. David had a big role. William had a certain large role as well. Lawrence had a big role too. They called him Mr. Conservation for much of the 1970s and 80s because of his role spearheading conservation movements. Just like Prince Charles, Prince Philip earlier on, Prince Bernhard, the founder of the World Wildlife Fund. So all of these guys have a very big fetish for both aliens, and I didn't mention this, but Prince Philip also had a huge fetish for decades around aliens, and he talks about that.
He looked like one at the end. He looked like a vampire.
But you're like, okay, they also have this amazing passion for saving the environment and conserving nature. You're like, well, are those two separate things? Kind of they are, but there's actually points of connection that are very disturbing too. They also have a very strong commitment, like in the case especially of Lawrence Rockefeller, for psychedelics. And
share something with me. You're saying that there's a connection. I don't want to leave that. What is the connection?
Well, and this gets at the title where I brought up MK Ultra and UFOs and Lawrence Rockefeller, because MK Ultra, for those who don't know, was a project that came about through research that was done originally by Britain's Tavistock Institute on shock therapy and how do you break down, disassociate somebody from their identity so that you can reconstruct their identity according to the standards and norms of whatever social engineers happen to be running the experiments of the human rats in a cage. They found that certain things were very useful. They first had batches of people who were survivors from World War I who had shock therapy, and they found that there were certain characteristics that this data set gave them, like especially trauma. Heavy trauma involved disassociation. Also compartmentalization of memories, if the memory was as horrific as possible. Over time, they found that certain drugs were conducive to accelerating these things. LSD-25 came out of that research program. MK Ultra was the American branch that was sort of the more applied form where massive money was provided in 1953-54 when this thing got off the ground. It was both an FBI and CIA operation. Both organizations worked together. And what we found, so first of all, Lawrence Rockefeller's is part of this process. It didn't go away with the Church Committee hearings that exposed MKUltra in 1975. It's not like it just disappeared with that exposure. It simply normalized itself in a variety of ways. They did literally millions of experiments involuntarily on human prisoners, psychiatric patients, other people who were just simply abused, who for various reasons, and literally countless people have been through this process. Some of them probably think they were abducted by aliens and anal probed. The reality is MKUltra was a vast operation all over Canada as well. Montreal was a beachhead for this, with Ewan Cameron doing human experiments with shock therapy and LSD and other things.
Was that also the therapist for our first lady, Margaret Trudeau?
I think he was. I'm vaguely remembering. I'm getting an association there, but don't quote me on that.
I believe so. I believe he also was the individual when she was having her breakdown going to Studio 54.
All of the stuff. So Lawrence Rockefeller is somebody who's also supporting the Green Earth Foundation,
yes,
pouring all of the money behind Terence McKenna and McKenna's international research into psychedelic mushrooms and the compilation of the best formats of, or like an encyclopedia, and a whole set of international laboratories to create better psychedelics. So he's also the primary backer and founder of that. He's also the primary backer of the Human Potential Foundation, which grew out of Tavistock with the Human Potential Movement. Tavistock being something which played a direct role in creating the Esalen Institute in the early 60s, utilizing some of the work of Aldous Huxley, Timothy Leary, who were trying to create sort of basically it was a spiritual eugenics, to create a new type of, as both Leary and Huxley describe, a new type of post-Christian age of humanistic paganism, with the help of things like Aldous's Soma, which was LSD-25, and Aldous even talks in his Brave New World Revisited how 10 years later, it's so wonderful that we found something for Soma. I didn't even know LSD existed back then because it didn't. But he's like, now here we are in 1950, and LSD is working really well, getting better results than I even anticipated. So people think that all this is warning us. No, I'm sorry. He was a part of it. So was his brother. So
his brother worked for the UN. Is that correct?
His brother was the founder of the United Nations Education, Science, and Cultural Organization, and was the president of the Eugenics Society of Britain at the same time as his brother.
Can you share with us just briefly what eugenics is, for those who do not know what eugenics is?
Yeah, eugenics is a pseudoscience of weeding out the human gene pool and creating a new type of human species with traits that are deemed to be preferable by a governing class, and weeded out traits that the governing class disapproves of. So they created a whole pseudoscience. It was this fundamentally statistical mathematical science created by Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, in the 1880s. Darwin was having correspondences saying, you've won me over fully to your cause. At first, he didn't like the idea, but then afterwards he was like, wait a minute, you've actually done it. And Darwin says, you've now made a disciple out of me. So it's like just the extension of Darwinian laws of the jungle.
And just before we go back to Lawrence Rockefeller, so my understanding is eugenics ended up being the Holocaust was the worst sign of it, right? Like they just wanted to get rid of an entire race. And most people don't know that eugenics really got its birth and its popularity amongst Rockefeller and Carnegie and Ford and Margaret Sanger, who was a spokesperson for the KKK, and she also got an award from Adolf Hitler. And for those of you who don't know who her successor was, it was Bill Gates Sr., and they rebranded the Negro population project. They renamed it Planned Parenthood, just to give our audience just some context. So Lawrence Rockefeller, MK Ultra, LSD, and UFOs. Let's go from
UFOs.
there.
So I didn't get to the third thing, or the fourth thing that Lawrence Rockefeller is his greatest life's passion was not necessarily these other things I just mentioned. Those were part and parcel of the process, but really it was extraterrestrial disclosure. And in the early 90s, when he began meeting with Hillary and Bill Clinton, he unveiled and created an umbrella organization which was designed to sort of unify all of the splinter UFO groups around a broader control, and that was called the Disclosure Project. Within that Disclosure Project, a famous character by the name of Stephen Greer, a bodybuilding physician, was recruited to that process, and that's been sort of his bread and butter for the past 25 plus years. And the question then becomes, knowing what the pedigree and the mandate of the Rockefeller family is, and who they are beholden to, going back, as you pointed out, to the original Rockefeller Family Foundation fortunes that were bringing eugenics into practice in the United States and into academia in the
and pharmacology.
Huh?
Pharmacology, sorcery.
Well, and this also took over this destroyed the holistic approaches, the natural approaches of homeopathic medicine and other things that were prevalent in the 19th century America. All of this was crushed.
It's all tied in, right? It's like
it's all different parts of the same thing.
Population, MK Ultra, UFOs. It's all tied in. It's like almost like like the spider.
It's to see them as different sides of the same thing. Don't treat them like different things, though they have their own individual character, but they're all interconnected in different sides of the same operation. Ultimately, what the unifying character is that there's an idea of human beings, which we are not, but though we are expected to conform to a false idea of human beings made in the image of talking cows, that is what animates this whole fascist system. Going back to the days of ancient Roman Babylon, there's always the same commitment to human beings must be this for our system of hereditary power to be justified. If human beings are not this thing that we say they must be, we cannot justify our own existence. So they must be that, despite the fact that they demonstrate evidence to the contrary all the time. We have to ignore all of that evidence, pretend it doesn't exist, and only showcase human beings at their worst, being war-making, ignorant beasts, which is where today's mass media conditioning comes in handy.
And at the same time, what you're sharing is these people who are unelected, who through inheritance become useless eaters, who think that they have more value than everyone else, they are the ones, if you go and start looking at the wars and everything, they're the ones who create the wars. If you look at the First World War and the destruction of the society, what was it? It was the killing of just one man, Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914. It was one man, and we're talking the whole 20th century, all the debauchery and all the wars and everything happened because someone in this elite class. It didn't affect someone who was on a farm in the Midwest. However, it did affect them. It didn't impact someone in India, but it did. It was like just because they created it. And this is why I wanted you on, because if you don't know the past, now we've sort of like, we don't have like royalty, but we have billionaires who become that, and they're making decisions for us. I'm not going off track, but I think it was in 2001, like they had the Super Billionaires Club in New York, where you had like Rockefeller, you had Gates, you had Oprah Winfrey, you had Bloomberg, and they were talking about population control and controlling what they perceived as useless eaters. So what you're actually sharing right now, to bring it back to where we're going, is that these individuals have an ultimate plan. and it doesn't include us. And they're going to use whatever they can to distract us, to prove to themselves that we are useless eaters. And you and I, being useless eaters, we choose to have a little higher expectation of our ability, because we are created in the image of God. And anyone who doesn't see that a human is a miracle, then I really feel sorry for them. And the truth is, I vote for Team Humanity. And if we wake up, because Newton had a very simple understanding that he taught us: from every action, you get an equal reaction. And I'm starting to believe that's happening right now.
Yeah.
And that's why you're speaking out and you're educating people on this, because only through knowledge and self-introspection and taking ownership and knowing what the narrative is, are we going to change it to our liking,
Oh, yeah.
which is pro-human.
Yep. Oh, yeah. No, I mean, if you're not going to stand for humanity at this point, I mean, what are you going to stand for? And I mean, that's the thing. Like, there's a sort of demoralization. The oligarchies of this earth have always, their target population that they want to manipulate, be nihilistic as possible in general, or alienated from the continuity of their deep past, the sacrifices that were made by great people who came before them, the generations yet to come, whose lives will be either benefited or made worse by virtue of the actions we take or don't take in the course of the time that we're allotted on the earth in a physical existence, right? So they want us to be disassociated and sort of atomized in that sense. And to the degree that we are, like I said, then we fall into the situation where we're more easily hypnotized. The hypnotic techniques that were innovated by people like Bandar and others who were tied to Tavistock. That was something that Aldous Huxley looked at very seriously too, is the role of hypnotic trances, hypnotic techniques.
When you're saying Bandler, are you talking like Bandler and Grindler of NLP?
Yeah, and neuro-linguistic programming came exactly out of it.
And Bateson and also Margaret Mead, they were all part of that.
Oh yeah, big time. Yeah, and they were being bankrolled, like I said. The entire Esalen Institute that was promoting the early seminars with the corporate class, the other things, people like Margaret Ferguson, who wrote the Aquarian Conspiracy. She was putting a manifesto, which came out of Esalen and Tavistock, for a world that would learn to think with their emotions. The world that would be, and it would be an Aquarian conspiracy of all of these people who had been processed through Stanford, through the Esalen Institutes, all of the who would be endowed with the utilization of these spells, right? The new magic spells.
Margaret, what's her name? Margaret Max Hubbard.
She was a big part of that, and she was bankrolled by Lawrence Rockefeller as well.
Was she really?
Yeah.
On a side note, I'm going to take this off. Back in '99, just before my father died, I saw her book called Co-Creation. So then he died. I was in Florida, so I went and bought the book. And she was the only person who never responded to me. You know, she tells her story in that book and whatever. But what I discovered, and this was mind warping. She was starting an institute, and she had like 180 books on this list of books that were going to like screw up your brain. And I remember I read them. And I just remember, it's like, I just remember that, it was very disappointing to find out that Dr. Zelensky, what was the Orthodox guy, he just died.
Protocol.
Z-Stack or whatever.
Oh my God, hold on, it'll come to me.
Well, he said she was the devil, and I'm going, oh my God, like, I wrote to her 3 times telling her how much she influenced me. She's the only person who never responded to me, but I read those 180 books. And I got to tell you, the reason I'm a weird guy, because those were pretty heavy books, talking about the noonosphere and Pierre, what is it, Pierre?
Ayal de Chaldin.
Yeah, that's it. Did you read that book?
I read chunks of it, not the whole thing, but I've definitely, I understand her. I understand where she's coming from.
Yeah, and it's like, they're all tools. This is the conclusion
yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, like, they're not.
I got a question, Matt, just on the side note, how did we not become tools? Because I always think that I can get so wrapped up. I think they could say flight, fight. No one ever focuses on freeze, because I know what's happening. You know, anybody who goes and reads and sees, and I listen to you, and I listen to all these, you know, interesting thinkers. Like, you know, I've even listened to Alex, and I've listened to Ike, and I've listened, you know, I've read them. I like reading, I like listening. And at the same time, I'm like, okay, I sort of know that there's something up. And yeah, I can like leave. Like I just spoke to a woman who was organizing the protest at Queen's Park in Canada with Chris Sky. She was scared that Children's Services were going to come to her for her son, so she left. So she took action and left. And then there's other people who say, I have to fight. And, you know, those are two healthy human reactions, but no one ever talks about the 99.99%, that phrase. And I just want, like, this is a freeze moment, right? Like if aliens came, if they projected some hologram into the sky, or they went into the water supplies and they put LSD into the water supply, and we would all, like, you know, hallucinate, you know, we would all, the freeze part, because it's one thing, it's good to know, but that's the part that frightens me, because I don't know when it comes down for me to make a moral decision. Will I make the right moral decision, or will I just freeze? Because that's where we get to test ourselves, right? Because you have this knowledge about the fact that the next step is they want to scare the hell out of regular people who want to live good lives, that there's going to be little gray men and lizard people and all sorts of stuff. And you had this movie that came out with Stephen Greer. Well, he says, like, hey, they're gonna scare you to death to, you know, take you over, and they're telling us. Most people never listen to it, but then, you know, I become a nihilist. Like what do I do? I just sit there. What do we do? Like, Matt, what do we do?
I don't have all of those answers. I have a sense of what works in history. I have a sense of what.
So tell us what works, because this is it. What works in history? One thing that I hope there's enough Cincinnatus out there that step forward and say the Republic is worth it, humanity is worth it, and they're going to go and look at a spoiled brat like a Rockefeller or a Bill Gates, all these entitled people, a Prince Charles, I can't give him the title, king, you know, and just say, little boy, I'm not listening to you.
Yeah.
Go and you'll see that they've never had anyone say no to them because they've been so privileged, and they hang out with their own little groups and they have those conversations. What are we going to do with people? Yeah. And if you watch a documentary on eugenics, that's what the wealthy in America used to do. They used to talk about, what are we going to do with those people?
Yeah.
You know?
As if you're not part of the people. Like, what are you? If you're like, yeah, they're speaking like anthropologists talking about some other species without realizing there's no self-awareness that maybe you're actually part of the thing you're talking about.
Well, they're not part of it. They're not part of it.
Psycho-spiritually, they're not. I think, like, birth-wise, Prince Philip or Prince Charles, if as a baby, given another set of experiences, likely could have awoken something good and beautiful and natural and human if they were just given real love and hugs and given a real experience as a human. But they didn't. They were born into, unfortunately, these hereditary oligarchical traditions that have their own cultural matrices to screw up, like really pervert, and they've got it down to a science, the next generation, right? To traumatize, and they pass on by victimizing their own kids, they traumatize and then pass on certain habitual traits that make them more conducive to becoming superstitious fools. Like, for example, Queen Victoria actually believed there, somewhere along the way, a myth was created that Jesus didn't die, that he basically lived a long life with Mary Magdalene, had kids, and the family of Jesus has been maintaining a continuity, which is at the heart of the royal family. And the royal family, Queen Victoria, for example, was an open, devout believer in what's called the British Israelite cult, meaning that this lost tribe of Israel went to the British Isles. And that is what has been both, tied to the Jesus bloodline. It's tied to everything else. And she believes that she's the heir to this. I'm sure that Queen Elizabeth and I'm sure King Charles probably believe the same thing. Now, the thing about the oligarchy is they're myth makers. They create myths both for their target masses, but also they create myths for their own elites. Transhumanism that was crafted by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and his perverted notion of the noosphere.
That was a Jesuit who was I guess a dinosaur digger in China who wrote a book on the noosphere that his work was not allowed to be published until 10 years after he had died. And he was talking about, I guess, like the 0 point, like when technology, we were going to be merged to some
machines and everything else.
Machine, yeah.
Tied with the spirituality. It's like the age of spiritual machines, or that Ray Kurzweil wrote about when he talked about the singularity. He's just being influenced by an updated version of Chardin's concepts of the Christ consciousness. And ultimately, Chardin is also a lifelong eugenicist. He's the guy who coins the term transhumanist along with his buddy Julian. They're working together, Julian Huxley. And Chardin is at war with real scientists of those days who were looking at anti-Darwinian evolution, rightfully so, like Vladimir Vernadsky, and doing it in a way that involved a recognition of the sacredness of life and not simply seeing human beings as the effect of Darwinian impulses. Chardin just sort of, his assignment as a Jesuit infiltrator and a Darwinian Nietzschean, a follower of Nietzsche, and how you're a Catholic priest and a follower of Nietzsche is beyond me. It's not possible. But I
found it very interesting when I read it. I was going, oh, look how liberal he is. Like, he's talking evolution. He's a Catholic priest. So
no, his assignment was to infuse Darwin into the church, undo the sacredness of human beings, and he saw himself as a new Moses, as somebody who was going to craft a new religion. He writes about that. His idea of the noosphere is completely devoid of free will, reason, or actual truth.
He's the founder of the New Age movement, because just giving some context, I shared this with you.
Yeah,
I actually was introduced to Barbara Max Hubbard, who, for those of you who do not know who she is, she ran for the vice presidentship in 1984. And she almost got it instead of Gerald Jean Ferraro. And she was New Age. And this was the cornerstone of the New Age movement, was Pierre Dish, I can't pronounce his name, but he was the founder of all this spooky, mystical stuff that's happened in the last, I guess, 75 years.
Well, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, his ideas gave birth to transhumanism, and he's the first to coin the term transhumanism, which he did alongside Julian Huxley, who was a close friend of his for many years. His assignment was to infuse Darwinian pseudoscience into the Catholic Church. That was his job. And so he was part of a network of what are called modernists. They're people who typically were around a sect of Jesuits in France and in other places, but mostly in France, who believed philosophically that the only way for Christianity to stay relevant was for the church to adopt the values and traditions, either artistic or scientific, that were dominant in the modern age. Now, it didn't matter if those dominant values or traditions were wrong. The fact that they were dominant was sufficient proof enough that they must be true, because only that which is popular is that which is true. If it was untrue, it would be unpopular. So we wouldn't even hear about it. This is the idea of like the evolution of ideas using Darwinian natural selection, right? The weak, false ideas disappear and are replaced by the stronger and more fit ideas. So they had a whole metaphysical idea of Darwinianism, and that's what they used to bring into the church. And his assignment was to infuse Darwinism. He was on the team that brought us the Piltdown Man. He brought us the that which was a hoax. The Piltdown Man was a complete hoax. Didn't exist. It was a cranium of a human with a jawline of a monkey that they just fixed together, fraudulently, just like found it in England and made it a thing. Then he was another on the team again when that didn't work because people realized that it was a fraud after a few years. He because they had to find the missing link because there's no missing links in fossil records. So they were like, well, where's the missing link between monkeys and humans? Then he comes up with the Pekin Man when he's off. And he's been banished now. He's been living in China for 20 years, and he's all of a sudden on some random team of British scientists discovering now the Pekin Man. When he's like, aha, here's the half man, half monkey that we've been looking for. What happens? They lose the bones. They put them on a train. Nobody ever sees the bones again. They just have his word for it. And to this very day, they still use it as if it were somehow proof of Darwinian evolution, which it is not. It's a fake.
It's interesting that it's all, according to Joseph Campbell, old wine in new bottles, and that's what this UFO.
Yeah.
And you're reading about these narratives that they're playing to. This is something that if you go to the Sumerian tablets, they talk about the archons, and they talk about, you know, all these gods coming from space, and then everybody would, like, you know, run. They're like, you know, these gods are happening, and they probably ran to their kings, and the kings, like they were, I was reading that, I believe it was the Incas or the Mayans, like the priests knew when there was going to be eclipses, and they would play that against their people, that they were able to, you know, they were talking to the gods and they could make this happen, and they had this sacred knowledge. They were the inside. But you know, the beautiful work that you're doing, Matt, you're exposing it. You're going through these first documents, and you're saying, hey, these guys are really not that smart, because if I'm a criminal, I wouldn't let anyone know what I'm planning. Like, if anybody goes to the Rockefeller, you know, lockstep documents, or to John Hopkins, they'll see that the crap that we experienced over the last 2 years, like, they wrote it out. Like, it's just, it's like, there's no creativity here. Like, and it's, I think that's the only thing that we have going on our side, and for people like you. So I go back to the question, what do we do with this knowledge? Yeah.
Before we say that, so because the key thing with this knowledge is, and it's true, like, knowledge has a power to it, but it also has, like, wisdom is both, it has many aspects. One thing, if people want to look at, well, what do you do? How do you feel? How do you think? What's a good role model for what has worked in the past that scares the oligarchy? What are their Achilles heels? Listen to Putin's speech of September 30th, where he's inaugurating or announcing the joining of the 4 new member states to Russia from East Donbass. That speech is a must read. You have to listen. Everyone has to actually study what he is saying to see what is actually possible, because this has been done before. What he is invoking is, and what he's calling out, has been something which you will see in some of the best speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., of John F. Kennedy. The fact that it is still alive in this day of darkness and stupidity is incredible.
I would also suggest that everyone watch the documentary that Oliver Stone did.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
With Putin, because what Putin is actually saying is, the sad thing is, and this is really sad, I grew up thinking we were the good guys. I really did. However, every society goes through a fall. There's a gentleman, he wrote an essay in, I believe, 1976, Sir John Glib, The Fate of Empires. Have you read that?
Nope.
Oh, I'll send it to you. Basically, what he shows through studying the totality of human history is that every empire, for some reason, it's almost in our DNA, that the same thing happens after 10 generations. You have a heroic people who overcome, and then they institutionalize, and then it becomes very economic, and then it becomes intellectualized, and then the societies all fall for the same reason. It's because the people inside of it just don't want to fight for it, and it's always like some more primitive group that overthrows that society, because the people just become so decadent. Sort of like a really wealthy kid can never live up to what his father did. Think about those founding fathers. Think about the men who believed in country and they lined up to join in the First and Second World War because they knew that there was a moral compass. And now you basically, it's relative, everything's relative. And on top of that, we're so divided, we don't have, nobody, like, what are you? Like, Matt, what letter do you want to be? You want to be rim glasses guy? Like, you want to be guy with like white shirt? Like, right now, it's all about dividing us instead of uniting us. And I think I have a conversation tomorrow with a gentleman who I believe is the greatest storyteller, moral storyteller. And I think what we are lacking is a narrative that inspires and lifts. Because what I read in your article about Lawrence Rockefeller, MK Ultra, all this stuff it's like to bring us down, not bring us up, to elevate us. And I think that's what's lacking. And that's lacking in our youth. And that's also, in my last book, I focused on male initiation and also eldership, because those have been lost in our society.
Yeah.
And if we don't honor our elders and we don't protect our young, we're nothing.
Absolutely. I mean, like I was saying earlier, the quote from John Quincy Adams is very clear that a democratic republic can only work if you have a devoutly religious and moral society. And if you don't have that, you can't have sovereign people, a sovereign nation, nothing. It'll only be a name only. So as far as like the question is always, why are people falling for really dumb stuff that has been done again and again throughout history? What is the, as who was it? It was Shakespeare writes of Cassius talking to Brutus, that the fate, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. So it's not like we can find faults necessarily ultimately in otherness. Yes, there is an oligarchy. Yes, they have very satanic ambitions. They're really perverted and really on the wrong side of history, but you can't say all your problems are caused by them. It's also caused by the fact that there's something within the people accepting certain false modes of thinking, false modes of feeling, being, which we accommodated and went along with because it was comfortable. We were given pleasure. And so that's why a lot of people think we won World War II. We're the best society ever, because look at all of the comfort that we have lived in for the past 70 years, since World War II. We must, if we have that comfort, it must be because the good guys won. And it's like, whoa, maybe you've been getting corrupted this whole time and you thought it was comfort and stability, but it was not. Maybe an operation was being deployed by people who think longer term cycles than you do. So we have to, I think, go inward and really self-examine our own
I want to
hearts.
unpack that, what you just said,
Sure.
because, and I don't know if you're comfortable saying this, but I've come to this conclusion. Before the last 2 years, I was agnostic. If I end up on the pearly gates and there's God, I said, I never denied you. There was always a possibility for you, right? Like, that's literally what it was. I'd be bargaining. I told you I was in sales and marketing. And now I realize, no, there has to be something that we're accountable to, something greater. Like, I'll give you an example. I was talking to someone who said he ran a private school in Ontario, and he couldn't teach the golden ratio, or he would have basically had his teaching, license taken away. Like, basic. What? Yeah, they're not allowed to teach that in school, because when you start teaching the golden ratio, it's like then there happens to be some type of divinity, right? Like, it's supposed to be, the world became the way it was because somehow
random
happened,
hitting a random particle, and
there's a really and I just want to share this with our audience, because there was a guy who studies stars and whatever. I can't remember what the name is. I'm having a senior moment of 53. But he uses a Rubik's Cube to make the argument for God. He says, if you take a Rubik's Cube and you give it to a blind man and he plays with it, it's going to take 126 million years. That happenstance just get the Rubik's Cube perfect. However, if you have an expert who gives a yes and a no to every move within 120 moves, within 3 minutes, that blind man will be able to get the Rubik's Cube. So all these people that you've studied in history, they were God-fearing. They understood their souls were more valuable than their things and their titles.
Well, that's what sort of helps. Like I myself as well, I was agnostic for many years. And it was really only when I began looking at history with a more critical eye and reading the writings of people who shaped history for good and for bad. But I really tried to focus on the ones who were indispensable, good examples of the best of humanity. And I started reading their letters, their writings. And I found that going back to ancient times, the writings of Plato, the writings of Cicero, the writings of Benjamin Franklin, you find a devout identities that have the same common principle of a devout relationship to their immortal souls, a concept of the creator as a force of goodness that they're made in the image of, and that they're willing to, and that they're even happy to sacrifice their pleasures of their flesh and even their living mortal bodies themselves, as Martin Luther King tapped into that and eloquently demonstrated, for the sake of the health of their souls. So you know that you can make your soul, your body can be healthier or sicker. Your body has food, it has poisons. And oftentimes people pay a lot of attention to these things and keeping their bodies in good fit, going to the gym, eating right, but they ignore the health of their souls, which are getting sicker and sicker by getting bad food, bad ideas, bad oligarchical forms of culture that have been given to us to make us more weak-minded, more weak emotioned. And we become more stagnant in that sense on a psycho-spiritual level. Whereas there's, listen to Mozart's Requiem, people say, oh, all music is created equal because it's all just how you feel. Well, yeah, compare the Spice Girls with Mozart's Requiem and tell me if you still really think that, because if you do, you're really far gone.
Define inspiration. That's the key. One of the individuals that Martin Luther King Jr. idolized was a gentleman named Abraham Heschel. He wrote a book called God in Search of Man, saying God is always out there. And Martin Luther King wrote the foreword saying it was the greatest book of the 20th century. It was very dense read. It took me like 3 months of constant reading it. And he said several things that always stick in my mind. For one, that you don't always have divinity, but if you keep at it, you'll have divinity. So if you're a writer, you know this as a writer, Matt, sometimes you have these moments of just clarity and brilliance that just come through you. And it's the same thing with you connecting with divinity. You have to keep at it. And the one thing that you've helped me with our discussion, I want to thank you, is about Lawrence, Rockefeller, and A.K.A. and Mockingbird and everything, this cabal that is giving this narrative. The greatest way to take action is to know that we are part of something so much bigger than us, and humanity is part of it. And this life is short, but our soul is infinite. And I believe that is the cure. And I believe providing this information, to me, the reason why I like talking to you, Matt, is because you're showing that if we go through the history, we're able to see that, to identify someone who realized that their soul was more important than their treasure.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the key thing. That's the thing that the oligarchy, that's their Achilles heel. The thing that they're themselves incapable of confronting is the truth of their own mortality. And the oligarchy is profoundly afraid of their own existence ending physically, because all of their spirituality is so enmeshed with the material pleasures and hedonistic considerations of the physical, world that we live in, the temporal
And
world.
they've infected us too, because
Yeah.
I was a materialist, and my religion was materialism. Before the last 2 years, it became quite obvious. This is really, no, you need an internal moral compass. So that means there's got to be something.
Yeah, there's a little as above, so as below, right? Like there's a little bit of the essence of the oligarch at the head of the table that will trickle down and express itself on all subdomains, right? There's a little oligarch within the drug lord in the local municipality, right? And just inversely, whenever you have somebody who exhibits real, truthful substance and moral leadership, like a Martin Luther King, that essence will also awaken in a more natural and healthy way every other element of those who give their admiration to such goodness, and they find something strong within themselves that that which they admire is exhibiting, like a Martin Luther King, which is very different from a Barack Obama, who just wants people to be in awe over their greatness or something and just stay lower. Martin Luther King is trying to create.
We need to go back to the old stories.
Yeah.
Go back to the old stories, the stories that actually, whether it's true or not, Washington could not tell a lie when he cut down the apple tree. Like, these stories have powerful messages, because since the 2000s, everything I see, I don't watch television anymore because it's dystopian. I watch like The Walking Dead. I'm thinking, well, hopefully someone blows my head off before it happens, because I don't want to be there after 10 years. So what's your last thoughts? What do you recommend?
Okay. Well, I would recommend here, first things first, for those who want to know how MK Ultra plays into the story of UFOs, which I didn't get to and I'm not going to, and I think it's good that I didn't say it. Read my article, which maybe a link somewhere, or wait for the book to come out, because there actually are concrete, direct, these things are two sides of the exact same operation. The UFO phenomenon after World War I, crop circles, all this stuff, and MK Ultra, the same people, the same institutions, were operated in both worlds for the same effect that Lawrence Rockefeller lived and devoted his commitments to, that he didn't even believe in. They just want to create a synthetic, new controllable cult for new stories that are controllable by a new age priesthood. That's what they want. The reality is, I think, much more in alignment with the type of orientation that we see coming out of the vision that is being expressed now and being defended by, well, the current defenders of civilization are not located currently in the West, but rather look at Russia, look at Putin, listen to Lavrov, listen to their speeches, listen to their allies in Eurasia, and listen to how they're able to compose a sense, not only an analysis of the problem, but a sense of the creative solutions to get us through the storm. That's available. We have residuals and potentials to awaken this once again, because we once had this in the West, but it requires that people, there's a state, action is easy, knowledge is hard. Some people think knowledge is easy, action is hard, and they just feel all good because they jump straight into action without taking the time to examine themselves, work on cultivating their powers of judgment first before taking action. And that creates a big mess. A lot of good people have been used by forces that they didn't understand throughout history because they skipped the step of knowledge before going straight into action. The Bolshevik Revolution, every color revolution, was made possible by the virtue of this type of thing happening. People acting before thinking. Good people who've been abused. Don't do that. I'm talking to the audience right now. Read Plato, read Martin Luther King's speeches, read John F. Kennedy's speeches. Feed the soul off of the quality of minds that have really been through the fire and matured to a high degree, so that you can awaken that within you too. So get these things. Listen to Mozart's Requiem a lot. Listen to Schubert's Death and the Maiden. Listen to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Listen to the things that really edify the soul and give you strength, both in terms of...
Pachelbel is my favorite.
Who?
Pachelbel.
Yes. I have not listened to enough of Pachelbel.
Oh, it's only just one piece that's just, it'll put you to sleep in a different context.
Send me a link. I'd like to see it.
I'm gonna send it. So.
Okay. So that's what I would say. I mean, those would be my final thoughts, is really work on yourself, work on the great ideas that have given birth to the best of human civilization, because that is what the oligarchy is afraid of. That's what they're trying to obscure. And that's and just in that sense, substance. Go for substance and make your judgments. Don't make premature judgments, but you got to take a stand. You got to make a judgment at a certain point. Otherwise, you're always going to be in a state of perpetual confusion and thus inaction when it's needed. So you do have to make wise incisions. So don't cut first, don't cut without thinking, measure 18 times, but you got to make that cut and then build upon real discoveries. So discovery upon discovery upon discovery. Don't ever allow some blind assumption to infiltrate the castle of your soul. You're building a structure. That is your worldview, your identity. And just like you would put a lot of effort, not skipping steps, if you were building a real house that people were going to live in, same thing. You have to be even more careful with the brickwork, all of the plumbing, the electricity, everything, and the geometry of the inner structure of the soul. But it can be done, and it can be done well. But that's why reading these great people is so important.
And I will add this: have charity for those who have not awoken to where you are. And as a final footnote, I just want to read the end of the Declaration of Independence, because it really says it all. It doesn't say I, it says we. Because we need a community and we need to come together. Because if you read Saul Alinsky, he talks about the elites not being together, not being a monolith. And that is something which is key to keep an understanding. And just give me a second. For some reason, I had it to read and it just vanished on me. This is like so beautiful too. We pledge. Let me just find it.
I got it here. Is it the beginning or the end?
It's the very end. Well, I'll let you read it. Yeah.
And for the support of this declaration, and with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Beautiful.
And that's all we have, and we have to remember the stories of the people who came before us. Thank you so much, Matt. This has really been helpful for me on my journey, and I hope it is helpful to the people who listen to us.
Amen. Thank you very much for this great conversation, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
And the greatest healer for anybody later on in life is to mentor younger people. And I find this all the time. I sit down with business owners all the time, and they always give me unsolicited advice because they want to share their knowledge, and it's really important.
Here with me is Peter Merrick,
president of merrickwealth.com.
Peter is an income and capital enhancement consultant,
speaker and author.
He is also a
recognized expert in the world of succession planning.
Over 800 published articles and 3 industry textbooks.
He's a Canadian who joins us today from San Diego, California. Thanks for joining us.
So, Peter Merrick, tell us about you.
Well, I've been in the financial service industry since the end of 1991.
I graduated during the recession. The baby boomers were in their positions, so there was no jobs. So the two businesses that opened up were the technology field and the financial field. It was the Wild West in both of them. So I had this brilliant idea, and I had a friend of mine, and we started talking, and I said, hey, how difficult would it be for us to get a mutual fund dealer license? Not difficult enough. Thank God for those 10 years, the market just went up. I would sit down and I would take somebody's entire life savings that they spent 15, 20 years accumulating it, this young kid who knew nothing about nothing, and I would go and just invest it, and luckily it went up because the markets were crazy in the 90s. It was a boom time.
But in 2004, my life blew up.
I almost went bankrupt, but I was very fortunate because there were very few CFPs at the time, but every university in Canada wanted to offer the CFP program, so I got recruited as a prof. And it was great. I was reading all the textbooks. I would call all the big publishers. And what I came to the conclusion was the succession planning was missing.
One of the issues is there was very little talking beyond the accumulation stage. Like, how do you have a healthy life after you've done that?
I also looked at demographics. At the turn of the 20th century, the average life expectancy in the West and North America was 43 years old. And people are dying at 83. No one ever lived to 83.
Well, so I always say that there's two financial plans. There's the financial one that we work on, and there's what you're going to do with all your time and that energy once you're done. And with this thing that they've been racing towards, they've hit it. But if they haven't thought about what they're going to do after or how they're going to feel validation for their existence, they just never stop. They just keep going.
Well, it's not anybody's fault, because when people are young, they focus too much on doing, and later on in life, they have to focus on being.
So I wrote my own textbooks because
I thought it was very important to talk about how do you transition from the first half of life, which Carl Jung called it the mourning, where you're accumulating, whether it's your ego, designations, education, houses.
The second half is deconstruction, giving wisdom away, giving away my money, giving away my time, leaving a legacy.
So talk to me about that stage. What's the purposeful way or kind of the best practices, ways, or considerations for people to take when transitioning into that stage of life?
Well, one, decide whether or not you want an exit. I find between the ages of 55 and 70, a lot of people feel that I'm just tired doing the same thing that I've always done, and I have the money now. So maybe I should get out when the going is good and pass on my business to someone who's got the energy to navigate it. Number two, who are you going to sell your business to? There's one issue about selling it to a family member or an employee. What happens after you sell it? Things don't go right. A lot of business owners want to sell their business because they just want to wash their hands. But by selling it to someone you know, you're not getting out of your business. The best is to sell to a third-party purchaser. The last one is after they make that transition from being a business owner, building a nest egg for themselves to have choice, they don't know what they're going to do. I've spoken to people who say, I'm going to take up golf. So my question is, do you golf now? I don't golf now. So what makes you think you're going to golf later? I just want to share with you guys a story.
There was a gentleman, his name was Bob Hunter. He was quite a celebrity. He started Greenpeace during the height of my blow up. When I was going through business loss, he was bringing me on national television. And you know what he was doing? He was saying, so Peter, don't you do that? And then he would give my phone number and he would give my web address. The reason why I went by merrickwealth.com, because it was almost like a phone number that would run across the television and I could actually see myself making money off of it. And he was dying. He had prostate cancer. And he turned to me and said, Peter, one day you will be in a position that you'll help someone else. And let me share with you about the legacy. Bob's been dead for 16 years. And I'm sharing you the legacy of Bob Hunter because he made a difference for me. And if I make a difference in anyone else's life, I'm a product of those people who are willing to do things and they had no expectations. And a true mentor is someone who has no expectations that they're going to see the tree blossom.
The reason I wrote The King of Main Street is younger people don't know how to find the right mentors, and older people have this need to mentor. It's almost like a biological need because they can see beyond their physical existence. They know that the sun was here before them and it will be after them and what's going to be left behind that they leave.
I would joke, I can't make you money, but I can definitely save you money. What I mean by that is I am a Sherpa. That's someone who would guide someone to help them come down. But I realize the most precious asset they have is not their money. It's their time.
What last piece of advice would you like to give our listeners?
If you have a business, the most important thing to ask yourself is, why did you get into the business? And it's usually not to create a legacy, it's to create the lifestyle that you want. And at that point, ask yourself, what do you want to do during your last days?
The last human freedom is to choose one's own beliefs, one's own way. Everything else you can have taken away from you. But what you believe and how you choose to act in the world, that is yours. And the greatest healer for anybody later on in life is to mentor younger people. And that is going to give you fulfillment emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. You guys have been wonderful, and I want to thank you, and I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you.